Hey there, Econ 421. We are in Chapter 10. This is Part 3. We're talking about immigration, legal and otherwise. Spend a few minutes talking about the history of U.S. immigration policy. You'll find the relevant table that gives the data on this on page 373 of your book. It's interesting. We've got the entire 20th century and observing how the variation in the rates of immigration changed over time. Extremely high in the first decade of the 20th century, went down to almost nothing, 1920s into the 30s and 40s, and then picked up again on a pretty even pace since then, and has remained, for the most part, pretty steady up through the end of the data in the book, which is 2014. Historically, there were few restrictions on immigration to the United States, and to the extent that there was any sort of restrictions, it was likely due to racism. It could be racism in terms of certain countries from Europe, immigration from Asia, and other places. From the mid-1800s onward, there was, of course, a massive migration from Europe that helped populate particularly the eastern and central parts of the United States, and then eventually moving over to our neck of the woods. And if we then resort to page 373 in the book, by far the highest rate of immigration, almost numerically, but certainly in relation to a much smaller population at the time, was in the early part of the 20th century. In the 1920s, Congress established a quota. The quota limited the number of people who could come from any given country, and it basically stayed that way until immigration reform in 1965, which was the first bit of legislation pushed by Senator Ted Kennedy, major legislation that he had a big hand in, removed those quotas. And things started to change a lot since then. Okay? Now, our focus here, the immigration stuff, like the migration analysis in the early part of the chapter, looks, focused on people trying to make a better life for themselves, and then making the determination that, in a utility sense, the benefits outweigh the cost in terms of present value. Of course, in terms of a policy issue, much of our discussion is on illegal or undocumented immigration. Okay? These are people who either enter the country illegally, or actually, I believe it's more common, they overstay their visa. Okay? And here's the conflict. Is it, on the one hand, harmful to native-born workers, meaning people of any background who were born in the United States? Is it harmful to them? And we'll see to what extent there's some truth to that. Does it present a strain on government resources? Obviously, there's a lot in the public press on that front. Or the alternative view that people more than pull their weight, and so whatever they contribute to society is more than what society provides them in the way of benefits, and to a large extent, are they attracted by jobs that native-born workers don't want to do? Of course, the most significant place where immigration, and particularly undocumented immigration, comes from would be Mexico. And the statistics are interesting. Mexican-born immigrants in the United States equals about 10% of the population of Mexico itself. So it's enormous. And it is driven mainly by economic considerations. There may be a little bit of political issues there, but for the most part, it's really people seeking higher economic opportunities. More than half of the immigrants here are not here legally. Do they have a high or low education? We normally think, no, they're not highly educated. They're coming here doing menial work initially, a lot of agricultural work. The theory would say low, but actually they're probably close to middle class because of the fixed cost associated with coming into the United States. You can't be super poor and be able to afford to pay for someone to help smuggle you into the United States. Okay? Many immigrant families, of course, are multi-generational, and in analyzing their experiences, we really need to take a look at a longer-term view, the initial generation and then subsequent generations. And it is clear that earnings rise quite a bit in succeeding generations. So even if the initial immigrants don't do that well, later on they tend to do exceedingly well. We'll take a look at differences in earnings when we deal with discrimination in Chapter 12. This is a different story. This involves people coming to the U.S., whoever they may be, and looking at their economic fortunes. Okay, why do people struggle when they come to the United States? Of course, some of it might be due to discrimination, and we will get to that in the next chapter that we cover. English difficulties, English language difficulties, which immediately reduce the pool of jobs that are available. Okay? Many people coming with the lack of a work history or the lack of a work history that is meaningful. It's not so easy to verify, and somebody having experience in another country may not be directly applicable in the sense that work experience in the United States would be. Generally, people less educated, there are obviously exceptions that prove the rule. And there are many immigrants who remain in their cultural enclaves, which of course gives them a sense of comfort, being with people who have similar backgrounds, similar cultural ceremonies and rituals and food, and is sort of like the comforts of home. But on the other hand, it reduces any sort of external pressure to learn English, and therefore it kind of maintains the reduction in the amount of opportunities going forward. Okay? Many move back, so one has to be careful in terms of looking at the economic success of immigrants, because those who are the least successful oftentimes will eventually just go back to their home countries. Okay. So, an interesting question, which we actually brought up at the very beginning of the semester, and now we can address it, is the following. Do undocumented or illegal immigrants take away jobs from people in the United States who otherwise would be filling those jobs? And the answer is a big fat maybe, okay? We're going to look at the general situation. When we deal with a minimum wage, there's going to be kind of a different solution there, and it's pretty simple. But the more likely circumstance is going to be competition, for the most part, with lower skilled workers in what we call the rough jobs. Rough jobs are not like roughnecks, but it could be physical labor, ones that don't involve high levels of education, and they may be distasteful. They may be the kinds of jobs that have a lot of the kind of the negative characteristics that we talked about when we dealt with compensating differentials. Okay, so here's the way